So the topic of this week is a thorough review of institutional AI teaching policies. I knew this would be a beastly topic, but turned out being even a little bit more comprehensive than I thought. We don't need any data to tell us what a problem this is or how pressing this issue is. But I guess just in case, we need to sort of quantify the business case. According to UCLA, 50 to 75% of students use Gen AI to support their coursework. And how they use it, a lot of different areas, researching a topic, brainstorming for writing, studying for exams. I happen to think there's a little bit of bias in these surveys. My own instinct is, particularly with undergraduate students, a lot of them use Gen AI to actually, unfortunately, write some of their assignments for them, for example. And so I also am a little bit skeptical that it would be this low. I think this was from maybe late 2024. The number's probably much higher now. So we know that this is a significant problem. And one more thing that really kind of captured the gravity of this for me was just going through grading this semester. I had done business writing courses in the past and seen it firsthand, but something about this semester in particular, grading papers, you can recognize which papers used ChatGPT and which didn't, especially because I use ChatGPT all day, every day, along with Claude, Gemini, and a lot of different tools. So ironing out the policies here, I just feel like it's so pressing. And even with all the AI committees and perspectives, it's still underappreciated, I feel. So main sources we analyzed for this deck and presentation, a few major institutional policies at the university level and at the level of, for instance, the National Education Association, some pedagogical frameworks, some perspectives, practitioner articles, and then maybe most importantly, over 200 syllabus policies. I will point you to a great database that has, I think it's 201 exactly, syllabus policies that relate to AI. And then there's a handful more you can find in some really good articles. So we tore through all of those and did some interesting data and analytics. These are some logos I put together initially. Really, they only scratched the surface. I can get into it, but there was dozens and dozens of institutions. At a high level, this is what the AI policy-making environment looks like. You have an institutional level and a classroom level. And again, there's a lot more here. Every organization is slightly different, but for the most part, this is what it looks like. The institutional level is where you're dealing with things, let's say, just to an extent within the library, but within the research offices, certainly within the IT office and IT risk assessment office. Institutional levels, thinking about things like information security, privacy, and accessibility. No surprise there, but I guess I was surprised to see the fairly narrow scope that was being tackled by the institution level. My initial instinct was that things like pedagogy was also to an extent being covered. But the point is, that's the institutional level. The classroom is really where all of the, let's say, innovative learning policies are happening, as it should be, is my gut instinct, particularly after putting this together. And then I would say the two together tackle the topic of academic integrity, albeit maybe a little bit more in the classroom. So academic integrity, of course, being how and to what extent do you have to cite the use of Gen AI in the classroom? In your papers, for example. I would say this sort of belongs under here, but there's some institutional involvement as well. And indeed, in my opinion, concerns about learning outweigh all others at this moment. That's not to say those other things aren't important. I think it's more that the same playbook that, let's say, the IT office at a particular university had used to evaluate some cloud applications for their security and privacy standards. I believe that playbook hasn't changed all that much with this new space of Gen AI tools. That's my instinct. So InfoSec, plagiarism, that is something different. And even grade inflation, which going into this report, I initially thought would be an enormous problem. That's an enormous result of using Gen AI in the classroom. Turns out really, again, restructuring your curriculum, if you will, and building some learning policies that make sense is actually kind of the toughest thing to do and the highest priority. So, Johns Hopkins nailed it. A valid concern specific to education is the tendency to rely on AI as a substitute for demonstrating and growing critical thinking and problem-solving skills. That is in the classroom as it relates to, say, any topic, any subject, right? Math, writing. However, we see it firsthand at more with respect to research. There are indeed tons of stakeholders we work with that are concerned that if you have what a lot of other tools in our space have, in my view, is kind of a question and answer platform, you can quickly get a long report, a research report, and students don't have to pour through full text articles. That is really going to impede their learning, and I agree. And so this really is a challenge across every aspect of the classroom, every aspect of academia. I just thought this was really interesting. It's a little bit off topic. It doesn't fit in, but I did the research going into it because I thought it was important. But a quick note on the macro impacts on grades and what I anticipated would be a significant increase in grade inflation as a result of AI. At least according to this study from the Center of Economic Policy Research, and I think based on a very quick review of other papers and articles, turns out it's not such a significant macro impact, AI's macro impact on grades. Other things have led more so to grade inflation than AI, and those things have been going on for the grade inflation problem, if it is a problem, has been going on for a couple decades. The real kind of specific effects have been AI compatible courses, i.e. courses using AI, obviously, saw a 1 to 1.5 point boost as a result of ChatGPT. I think the main message of this paper was that it's not as much overall grade inflation. It's much more that the discrepancies between students is tightened, if you will. It's narrowed. And as a result, grades are becoming less and less of an important signal for employers. And that's a very valid point. And so 25th percentile students gained 2 to 3 points. Failure rates fell by 33. Fewer failures and low passes equals weaker signaling value of grades. So that's, very interesting. And one last thing is early AI exposure improves performance in later courses that use AI, but no gains and even sometimes losses in exam-based courses that don't use AI. So I just thought this was really interesting. We can sort of refocus our goals and the challenges we're working on. And then I have to say one more article that captured my attention I have all the wrong reasons. I X'd out the author, but further evidence that everything exciting is happening in the classroom. This is I believe it's not a Harvard Business Review, but Harvard Business Publishing article, developing your institution's AI policy. And look, I just find there to be, candidly, a lot of very unexciting things here. Okay, form a task force. We know there's a lot of task force being formed that has all the stereotypical problems associated with it. So there's a lot of committees out there. Guiding principles, assess current AI use and needs, and implement pilots are both bullet points that I feel there's probably a little bit too much emphasis on in AI committee circles. Seems to me, implement pilots for, say, ChatGPT. Yes, if you're talking about enterprise pilots, but if you're just talking about general use of AI, it's not really fit for the moment, is my view. And then scale AI policy I've got my camera in front of us, across the institution. That is reasonable. However, I'll just say we've worked with dozens of universities. I view these AI committees as best able to lay out some policies and procedures, if you will. Rolling out technology via pilots and then rolling it out to the whole university at scale doesn't seem to be the best tactic, the best kind of application of this committee. So we use Claude. So the classroom is what I'm interested in personally. We use Claude to analyze 200 plus AI syllabus policies, 176 institutions, 71 unique disciplines, and these are the key results. Just in case you're wondering, 80% of classrooms permit AI in some capacity, only 20% prohibit, which is really interesting. The most frequent, as you can see, is permitted with documentation. The second most frequent is prohibited. Indeed, I'll get into some outliers as well. There are some instructors, for example, that not only permit it, but significantly encourage it. That is one item I want to really get into. Is it's not so clear as, hey, rules and regulations. A lot of it has to do with, in terms of the best syllabus policies out there, just qualitatively how you talk about the technology and how you'd like students to use it. Are you more restrictive or are you more permissive? I'll get into some specific examples there. Maybe counterintuitive, and take it with a grain of salt. Fields training for careers are more restrictive. Fields focused on critical thinking are more permissive. That sounds reasonable enough. However, I'll mention that is a theory that I inferred from the data. The data very well could not have a strong enough sample size, and it could be the case that policymaking is still very instructor specific and not tied to the fundamentals of a topic. But again, fields training for careers are more restrictive. Fields focused on critical thinking are more permissive. Business has the highest rate of prohibition, the highest prohibition rate on AI tools based on 15 policies, which is a significant amount, versus writing in English down at the bottom, 10.9% based on 46 policies. Again, the best explanation for this maybe is that, in business, there's a real need to be credentialed, if you will, and there's a direct link between there's a real need to showcase the skills you've learned in the classroom in job interviews and getting a job. But again, that's just one theory. Maybe the more important takeaway is just the diversity, right? I can't imagine you look at a section of a syllabus in many other areas, and you have this wide of a discrepancy between different policies. So maybe that is the bigger takeaway. The number one classroom enforcement mechanism we know for plagiarism is detection. That was, it seems to me, how folks solved the plagiarism problem. In this case, there is this real bend to use detection as well. Indeed, there is some good detection software out there that's just coming up. It's there's some very cool products that you can plug in or integrate with whatever. I believe you can integrate with Blackboard and then figure out to what extent it's probably ChatGPT written, whatever. However, that is an uncertain enforcement mechanism. We don't know if it'll pan out. And at the moment, it is more transparency that people are using. It is that instructors are using. That's two things: disclosing what tool, how used, where it affected work. That's sort of citing your work. And then secondly, if you've got the infrastructure for it, there are many instructors that actually request the ChatGPT logs, which is a really interesting approach. I don't have a particular perspective, but evidencing the logs, the chats, highlighted text, version history of the paper itself. There are a few different ways instructors ask to evidence your use of ChatGPT. My first instinct, in case you're wondering, is that disclosing significant disclosures of what tools you use for what would be very difficult. I view it as probably not practical in the long run to be able to ask students to say this line came from ChatGPT and that one didn't. I believe that doesn't lend itself well to some of the better applications of ChatGPT that students should be using it for, like, clearing up grammatical issues and whatnot. So evidence logs, that's another way to do it. The key elements of leading AI syllabus policies, and I have to give 100% credit to Daniel Stanford from DePaul University. And I'm actually going to jump in 1 second to his Substack post because I don't really feel the need to replicate all these things for our presentation. I'm happy to just completely cite this work. And indeed, in Daniel Stanford's blog, he had done a very similar synthesis as to what we did over those policies. And these are really great. I mean, I just copied and pasted them, and I'll show you the article. If AI is prohibited or required, explain why. That goes to that point of how you describe your policy qualitatively in spirit is as important as the specific rules you put on it, in my view. Connect AI to something familiar, like an analogy. I have thought a lot about, and we'll share in a second, some things about the calculator analogy. Or in this case, Daniel's getting help from a friend or tutor. Provide examples of acceptable and or unacceptable use. Acknowledge ethical issues. Note your AI documentation citation requirements. So these are more the rules. Excuse me. Explain how misuses will be addressed. One of my big policies in my classroom, I'm not going to pretend to have the most cohesive, well-informed policy, but one of mine is you suffer significantly in your grades if you don't catch, say, hallucinated sources. And so I've had many situations where it seems like a reasonable paper, and then the sources, I check them, they're fake. That results in an enormous grade reduction in my class. And so that is one way in which I do encourage AI use, but I significantly, frankly, punish students if they don't check the outputs. And then encourage students to ask questions about the policy if it's unclear. That should be the case with every syllabus area. One other thing I just want to show you quickly on Daniel's page, and I think everyone might find this kind of interesting. This is Daniel Stanford's page. Whoops. And I found very interesting, he pulled out a few examples. One is a permissive example, the other moderately permissive, and then a restrictive example. I think the permissive example is really cool. And I'm not going to read through all of it, obviously, but you could tell, obviously, this policy significantly encourages AI use. My view is that AI will impact us no matter what, but we also have the power to shape how AI develops if we engage with it thoughtfully. This is a safe space to experiment. You will not be penalized for using AI unless I say otherwise, blah, blah, blah. And then it says, but then has very clearly things like always validate the content before accepting it. So I have to tell you, if I was going to copy and paste, after doing all of this research, different articles and whatnot, if I was going to copy and paste an AI policy into my syllabus now, it would probably look something like this. I really feel this describing how you feel about the technology, why you have the rules that you have in place, and then what those rules are. It's a great format in my view. So I will link to this, of course, but these are really great examples. I will say one other thing, which is that when you look at other perspectives on leading AI syllabus policies, you look at articles that say, hey, here are 5 innovative AI policies. Just about all of them are incredibly permissive. My hunch after, again, looking through these and seeing these instructors describe the results of their experiments, if you will, is the results looked very good. I think it is probably going to be the case, if I had to make a forecast, that a lot of syllabus policies will become very, very permissive, and we should lean into it, which is a very difficult thing to do as well, though. A few last slides. I know these are text heavy, but there's a lot of data I want to sort of communicate. Best AI syllabus policies out there, as I've already mentioned, have qualitative info and sort of regulation, what I call regulations and principles or guidance. AI tools are valuable, but don't forget they're just tools. Use them as aids. You need to be able to make a clear distinction between AI-generated text and your own writing. Is this policy? I pulled this from I'll link to this as well, an article that had the top 4 leading innovative AI policies. Your voice matters. AI must never replace your reasoning or interpretation. Stuff like that is more important, in my view, than do this, do that. You can't do this, you can't do that. Maybe that's an unpopular opinion. And then students determine when and how to use AI tools within the context of authentic writing situations. Develop an internal decision framework. I think that's a very good way to describe it. And that's what instructors go through as well. A few final slides. One thing I did not find incredible literature or perspectives or data on is what I might call more of a high-level curriculum redesign. And this is even more to the pedagogy topic. I've talked, despite that being something that classrooms are really working on, I've still talked a lot about rules, regulations, and policies. I do think a second session on this topic will be about curriculum design. There are indeed some papers out there. Frankly, it is an incredibly underdeveloped area of literature. There are a million different ideas. There are no seminal papers, if you will. This is an area that's really up for the taking, and no consensus has formed. However, some additional ideas that have come out of this. One is shifting from just kind of repetitive based memorization, try and repeat memorization, to more critical thinking. I almost view this whole list as saying we need to get more into, how do I describe it? More of an academic mode, more of I hate to say liberal arts type mode. Embed AI ethics into and bias into all subjects. I think that one's pretty straightforward. Center curricula on hands-on project-based real-world learning, more in the classroom. That's a common theme, and I think it's a reasonable one. Emphasize adaptability, breadth in learning to learn over early specialization. And again, these strike me as very reasonable. If you look into each of these, there's about 20 recommendations. It's a little bit all over the place, but this will be a very cool area to track in terms of literature, track over the next year or so, and I'll make sure to do a second part to this. The calculator analogy is something that I got sort of hooked on initially, and I mentioned it before. And I view it as a damn good analogy. I mean, lessons from calculator implementation, which is kind of funny to say at this point, but calculator implementation, here's an example of a very widely cited article, the calculator analogy, virtues for using LLMs. And here are some lessons that were called out in this article that I view as very good. And then I want to get into something I didn't cover on this slide. No collapse of math skills globally, which is indeed just like, maybe not to the same extent, I don't know, but just like everyone's worried about maybe LLMs, for instance, writing skills collapsing globally. It is a very, very good analogy. There was no collapse of math skills globally. Biggest gains occur when calculators are actively integrated into instruction, not used as shortcuts. And so that is going back to the topic of, having very permissive policies and why that might actually work. Instruction, assessment, alignment is key. So if you can't, let's say, use, in this case, what this means is if you can use a calculator in your assignments but not the exam, it doesn't really work out well. Students' attitudes plus confidence in math changed little or even improved a bit with calculator access. And then finally, equity outcomes, less about device access and more about instructional quality. Now, there is a section of this paper that talks about why it's not a good analogy. I don't want to misrepresent the findings. In fact, I would say one of the key kind of conclusions is that you can only pull so much from that analogy. However, at least when I personally look at some of the reasons for it, which mostly come down to that LLMs solve more of the writing problem than calculators solve the math problem. So if you look at the end-to-end process, LLMs are involved in, brainstorming, actual writing, improving writing mechanics, the supply chain of getting to a writing output. The authors here argue that because LLMs cover more of that process than calculators cover in math, you get an answer in a calculator, you need to do a little bit more interpretation. It's not a good analogy. Without going into it much, I don't necessarily agree. I mean, it could be the case that there are different extents to which LLMs will affect learning versus calculators, but I think it's not a strong enough criticism to argue that the LLM AI policy should be restrictive, at least. I think this analogy proves very clearly that we should have, at least eventually, extremely permissive policies. So that is my takeaway from that. And then I'll just say, so we're a software company now. We used to be a research and strategy firm. So it wasn't that long ago we were doing strategy every day. And I haven't thought much about this, but if I had to come up with some quick suggestions, organizational structure-wise, it would be that institutions and administrative teams sort of perform a little bit of a servant leader role to the classrooms. After putting together this report, I'm fairly convinced that the real innovation has to be a bit more bottom-up. Innovation in pedagogy in particular is what I'm saying. Has to be more bottom-up. Instructors have to do it, and then, some of the institutions, admin teams, associations can learn from that. So institutions, admin teams, more servant leaders, try to be, in my view, less intrusive and regulatory, develop clear policies based on tried and true frameworks. Stay in your lane is my view. And in this case, staying in your lane means IT offices and even, research offices, libraries, academic affairs, whatever it is, should not be focused on solving the pedagogy issue. They should be focused on applying the tools they know well, the skills they know well, security, privacy, academic integrity. Apply those, make them clear, try to make them as flexible as possible, and then get out of the way is my view. Instructors and students, innovation leaders, experiment with these tools and policies to advance learning, iterate, and improve. That is what I would love to see in this landscape. I actually came into this report with the view that institutions aren't doing enough in terms of genuine learning policies. They're focusing a lot more on InfoSec and privacy and equity and accessibility. However, I come away from it thinking that is exactly what they should focus on. Now, maybe last thing I'll say here is the type of things that need to go away are this. We had a department chair, economics department at a major university, send me an email. I know her well. It's my alma mater, one of them. And she sent me, after I'd sent her a little bit about our products, she sent me an email. And that email was a forward from their librarian. And the email said, from the librarian, it said, "Dear all faculty members, every AI research tool out there does not comply with our publisher licensing agreements. Therefore, you are violating those agreements if you even log into a tool." And that is the type of stuff that, whoa, needs to go away very, very quickly. This space is just moving way too fast for things like that. And as I put out on LinkedIn this morning, my number one suggestion to the academic community is figure out a way to get to try for free faster. This is just not a software industry right now where you can afford to have a centralized committee of 15 people wrangled together to try out a product for a month, to then go through a deal process for 3 to 6 months, and then lock in a product for 2 years. And then that's the one you present to your faculty members. I mean, that company is going to be out of business by then. So we've got to figure out a way to be more nimble. And then my only mention of Mora before wrapping this up, I always have some kind of tie back into Mora. This one, my only mention is that we are working very hard to solve the harmful to learning problem. The same exact issues that folks deal with on the learning front in the classroom in every subject, as I mentioned, same one on the research front. And so you can see a Substack post I put out in October. Am I crazy to think we can flip the harmful to learning problem on its head? How we do that, in short, is that rather than having kind of a ChatGPT-like Q&A engine, we really focus on more of a project management workflow tool. And so I actually, again, my view, and sort of tying in with the theme of this whole session, is that we can actually use these technologies to improve learning skills rather than harm them. So I think that covers everything. The upcoming sessions are next week. It'll be best practices for prompting LLM. So literally, what are some quick tips and tricks and syntax you can use in your ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini prompts to get better outputs? The one following that has to do with gray literature. That is some white papers, industry white papers, working papers. What are the trends in terms of what's acceptable to include on a references list of a published paper? And then how are folks dealing with that in terms of citations and whatnot? And then finally, I've had this on the backlog for a bit, but lessons from AI's impact on software development. That's a very mature space in terms of AI adoption. I'd really like to break it down a bit. I've had this on the backlog. I keep pushing it out, but I do want to tackle it at some point. So really appreciate everyone joining. That concludes our session. Like I said, I'm going to make sure to put out these links with YouTube, and they'll go out everywhere. You should be able to see it. But really appreciate the time. Hope everyone has a great weekend. Thank you.